Hi, everyone. Hoping that you all are doing well. Thank you for joining us. We're going to be discussing the topic of commerce. Now, this time we are not discussing commerce with respect to the law. We are discussing commerce with respect to some observations that have been made in Scripture. This is a response discussion, and this is in response to a number of comments that have highlighted the centrality of commerce in a number of dynamics in terms of history. And so there have been some interesting notations related to commerce and scripture. And many of you have probably already picked up on it, but we are going to point some things out that are very important. Commerce serves as like these bookends for the book of Genesis and the book of Revelation. And so when you look in the book of Genesis and the book of Revelation, you see this highlighting of commerce, even if commerce as a word is not what is used. However, commerce as a word is what is actually used in both instances. And so what we see in the book of Genesis and in this book of Revelation is that commerce is tied to the original sin. Commerce is the underpinning for the original deception in the book of Genesis. And then when you go to the book of Revelation, there is quite a bit of discussion about commerce. And what's also noteworthy is that there is a final deception that is noted in the book of Revelation that again is tied to commerce. What's also noteworthy is that in the book of Genesis, commerce is attached to, in terms of the narrative, a beast. When you get to the book of Revelation, you have commerce again tied to this entity known as a beast. So we're going to look very briefly at this dynamic very early in Genesis that relates to commerce. As a matter of fact, it appears to be the first instance of commerce, followed by another instance of commerce, and then the naming of an entity, commerce. Now, with respect to commerce, we have these contract dynamics. And so there is a process of quid pro quo, or a tit for tat, or a this for that. What we see in the book of Genesis is a very interesting dynamic, this very odd commercial dynamic. And it takes place primarily between this entity known as Eve or Havah and this entity known as this beguiling serpent. And so in the narrative, there is this fruit that is supposed to bring all sorts of things with it. And so if you ingest it, according to this little crafty serpent, the person is supposed to be wise and godlike after consuming this particular piece of fruit. And so there is an exchange, however. And so initially, Eve is presented as unknowing but free. In exchange for knowing and not being free, there is this fruit. And so Eve takes the fruit and eats it. And what happens with this is there is an exchange, which is commerce. And the exchange is the freedom for the fruit, and the fruit is equal to bondage. And if you recall in the book of Revelation, there is a high focus on this dynamic of commerce. In fact, commerce is what leads to the end. Commerce is also a part of this end deception that takes place in the book of Revelation. So it's a very interesting dynamic, very interesting centering of this construct of commerce. But the way commerce is presented in both the book of Genesis at the very beginning and the way commerce is presented in the book of Revelation, both instances are problematic. Both instances, in essence, relate to damnation, essentially. And so, another interesting notation with respect to commerce is that commerce is equal to the word set. Yes, I know it's odd. However, here we go again with this set issue. And so, commerce, essentially, in terms of definition, is set. It's the same thing that's meant by set that you see in scripture or that you see with respect to this deity known as Set. And so we're going to look at this construct of commerce and how it is synonymous with Set. And of course, Set is tied to this little crafty serpent, this little beguiling one. Now, when you do a deconstruction of this construct of commerce, what you come away with in terms of definitions, in terms of etymology, is commerce is about replacing. It's about substituting things. Commerce is another word for swapping and switching and changing, altering. In essence, trade. And of course, you see this dynamic over and over again with this construct of set that essentially refers to placing, swapping, substituting, switching things out, trading, converting, and transforming. Now, in the book of Revelation, you see this swapping or this trading related to commerce, wherein there is a discussion about all of this commerce that has been going on around the world with all of these merchants and all of these leaders that lead to this damnation ultimately. But there's also a dynamic in the book of Revelation where it talks about if individuals refuse to swap, exchange, take, possess, then they won't be able to engage in commerce. And so the idea behind that is that commerce, again, will serve as this inducement to switch freedom for bondage. And finally, another thing that stands out related to the Crusades and the colonization efforts is that a big part of colonization involved converting and transforming, not just this religious conversion, but also the conversion of the people, replacing the people, substituting the people, swapping out the people, switching, changing, altering, trading. And what you might also note in the book of Revelation is the straw that broke the camel's back in terms of the commerce involved, the trading, the swapping, the switching, the selling of men and souls.